Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Writers and Fighters, a podcast. I'm your host, AJ Ortega. Every week on this show, I interview someone involved in writing or someone involved in fighting. This is episode 32, and I have a writer on today. B. Joshua Adams is a poet and critic calling in from Louisville, Kentucky. I found Joshua and his writing on Twitter and thought he had some cool poems, and his interest in cars, which it says in his Twitter bio, that interested me, and so I invited him on. We have a really good talk. Before he reads us a poem, he tells us about how he got interested in reading and writing. Then he tells us about how he navigates writing in different genres, because he does poetry, criticism, translation, and then we finish up talking about cars and a little bit of fight stuff. I want to thank all of y'all for being patient as I get this content out to you. Been a little down and out with some physical pain and then some mental brain fog and anxiety and things like this. But we're here now. And before I get to that interview with Joshua, I want to talk a little bit about UFC fighter pay, and specifically last weekend, Cheyenne Bays, a UFC fighter, she got a big win last week. And several months ago, she and her husband were on the same card, which was a historic first. Unfortunately, they both lost their fights. But over the weekend, Cheyenne Bays fought and won with a really spectacular head kick, timed perfectly and followed up with some ground and pound. Happened in less than a minute, or right at a minute, I think. And I'll try to include that in the show notes. And so it was an impressive win, and it secured the performance of the night for her, which includes a $50,000 bonus. And this is on top of her $10,000 to show up and $10,000 to win. In the post-fight interview and in the press conference, she mentions that she's broke, that she had just uprooted her life in Dallas, I think Dallas, and moved to Las Vegas to a new training camp and to be closer and all these kinds of things, and had to take out a loan from a few people, totaling $15,000 just to get into a house. And that her win would make $20K, and that would make her square so she could catch up. But that this $50,000 bonus is a game changer. It's quite life-changing to her. And so this brings up the issue about fighter pay. The UFC as an organization makes a lot of money, a ton of money. And a lot of folks within the UFC and those associated with it make tons of money. But does every fighter make big money? And the answer is no. The champions and big money draws make well into the six figures, and guys like Conor McGregor make a few million per fight. But I don't know if that's the way it should be. And it's hard because the fight game is not rewarding for most people. It's just like the writing world isn't lucrative for most people. Same thing with musicians, comedians, artists of all kinds, including the martial arts. And so most fighters have a day job and additional ways to make income as they train. And training takes time and money, so there has to be something to offset that. Especially after the UFC made the, I think, dumb decision to make their fight kits, the gear that they wear in the ring, they made them exclusive to Reebok. And then now Venom, this brand Venom, which means that fighters can't have their own sponsors on their trunks. And they used to get a few sponsors that would pay them, right? And so they can buy gear and train and pay for gym dues and a nutritionist and eat healthy and so on. And so without that performance of the night bonus that Cheyenne Bays got, if you fight every 3 months, that's like 4 times a year. And if you only make $20K if you win, again, at that level, she's not a superstar, at least not yet. I think she has only 7 or 8 pro fights, I think. And so if she's making $20K per fight, that's $80K a year, like if you win every match, right? And that doesn't seem like a whole lot. I mean, it's more than I make, but I'm in education and in writing, so I'm choosing to be poor every day. But it doesn't seem like a lot to me. And that's a super busy schedule, and injuries happen. And, it doesn't seem like a lot to me for a professional athlete competing in the largest MMA promotion in the world. Like, they're on my TV, so it seems like they should be getting that ESPN money, right? That ESPN level money, I should say. And so I'm a big proponent of fighters' unions and promotions giving them like health benefits and salaries and things like this, but mostly they're treated like independent contractors, and most fighters ain't getting rich and flying in private jets. The top few percent are, but most are not. So I'm happy for Cheyenne Bays, but honestly, I wasn't a fan of hers at first. Like after her first UFC debut, her first match of several months ago, she had kind of an attitude in the post-fight interview and chip on her shoulder, and I know she's very young in her career, and so I wanted her to be a little bit more humble in her first UFC loss. But this is a really good story, and I'm quite happy that it's going to help her get some financial security and pay off some debts. It's, that's a weird feeling to have that looming over you. I know that feeling. And so I'm quite happy that she got that fight of the night bonus, and instead of making $10K for losing, she won and got a bonus totaling $70,000 in one showing. So I think we'll see her again at the top of some prelims or at the opening of some main card in the future. And so I'm wishing her luck because, happily married pro fighting couple moving and sacrificing, it seemed to pay off. So I wish them both luck. All right, y'all. So that's my little thoughts on fighter pay in a very small nutshell. So let's get to that interview with Professor V. Joshua Adams. He's a poet, critic, translator, and he's a car guy. So it was a fun one, and so I hope you guys enjoy it as much as I did. All right, y'all. I am sitting here on Zoom with V. Joshua Adams. I should call you Joshua, though?
Joshua's good.
Joshua, awesome. So maybe tell us a little bit about who you are and how you ended up on this podcast.
Well, I am a poet and a critic and a professor at the University of Louisville here in Louisville, Kentucky. And I ended up on this podcast, I think, by means of the Twitter algorithm. Joined Twitter right when the pandemic started, actually, and posted some pics of work and also some of my other interests. And I think that may have led me to you.
Yeah.
And, I've listened to the podcast a few times now, and I'm happy to be in a context where two very different things are brought together, writers, fighters.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the Twitter algorithm said, hey, these people follow you, maybe follow this guy. And so there I am clicking around on my phone and saw some of your recent poems that you had gotten published. And I was like, very cool. And then in your Twitter bio, it says old books and old cars. And I was like, okay, we'll get to car stuff later in the podcast, sure enough. But that'll be cool because I'm a car guy myself.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, so that'll be fun. So cool. So poetry and criticism. Tell me what first got you kind of into reading and writing, because you're like me, professor, and write and get your stuff out there. This is a big part of our lives now. People can't see, but I'm looking at you, and you have all these books behind you, and so do I. And so tell me, what first got you into the reading and writing stuff?
So I wrote poetry as a child. I remember my mother putting a piece of mine, I think from kindergarten, on the refrigerator, a poem.
Yeah.
A winter scene. There were icicles, maybe a chipmunk puffing or something.
Right.
It was in free verse. That's what I remember about it. Irregularly spaced lines. And, it became a thing. I recognized interests. There weren't that many books of poems in my house when I was young. The ones I remember are Shel Silverstein, obviously, who was kind of, I think he was a ubiquitous presence in the 70s and 80s, maybe less so now, I'm not sure. But also a book of light verse by an interesting and somewhat well known, but also kind of obscure formalist poet X.J. Kennedy. The book was called Brats, and it was light verse about naughty children.
Nice.
I think the book had been a gift because the word brat was not welcomed in our house. So the book kind of acquired a talismanic sort of aura. Yeah. It was a bit, naughty. And later on, I went to some Saturday morning classes at the local community college for, kids to read and write poetry. And that's where I remember reading Blake and Wordsworth and Dickinson for the first time, and Frost too. I have strong memories of those. Sure. Obviously not their most challenging work, but
right.
I do remember reading that Dickinson poem about taking the carriage ride with death as I might have been like 10 or 11.
Wow.
And later on, I read French poetry in high school in French class, and Baudelaire and Rimbaud really blew my mind. And I thought, this is something entirely different, and I want a piece of this. And around the same time, I read Ep32, the love song of Geoffrey Prufrock, and that was it. And that poem spoke directly to me, and also, in a sense, for me, from across a big gulf of time and space. And that was an amazing feeling. And I thought, I want to do this. I think that poem is very commonly sort of a gateway into people's poetic vocation, at least for my generation.
I think also another one of those gateways is one of the things you brought up, early in the childhood, is you grab a hold of this book that's kind of has a taboo title, Brats, right? Or it seems like a little on the edges of what is maybe quote unquote accepted and read and shared in these ways. And so I remember seeking out those books, like, not reading stuff for class and then going to, finding out at the public library there's books with bad words in them. And I'm like, I'm going to read these, and that there was this attraction that it's like, oh, it's like they're trying to keep it from us, like school wise, but then I found it over here and it's public, right? It's at the library. And so you latch on to this thing that is exciting to read, right, and hold on to. I think that's a really cool start as well. I didn't appreciate the fact that Silverstein himself, though he was ubiquitous, there is a transgressive dimension. He had been a kind of countercultural figure, and I of course didn't know that at the time. But the delights of transgression. And it came back when I read Baudelaire and Rimbaud, because that's, at the center of what they're both doing. And so at a certain point, you're reading some pretty, I don't want to say heavy or complex, but I guess those are the words I'll use, poetry at a pretty young age. And so you were like a reader growing up, and like you were, like that's what kind of stimulated your mind, like literature and again, complex stuff.
I can't take total credit for it. I had an expensive education, and so a lot of stuff was presented to me.
Sure.
So I was very fortunate and privileged in that respect.
Word.
But I do think I gravitated towards stuff that was older.
Sure, that's what I'm trying to get at. Yes.
Really, when I first read *Midsummer Night's Dream* when I was 12, for example. That was a really incredible experience. So I tended to, even now, I tend to veer to the old often.
Okay, very cool. I also saw in there, and this may come into play with the French work you were reading, but you do work in translation. Tell me about how that came about and which languages and stuff like that. Tell me a little bit about that.
Sure. So, I mentioned the French poets, and I was reading them in the original, and one thing that was occurring, right, was that I had to translate them to have access to what the poems meant. And what I was discovering in those cases was something that was entirely new, that had not been a part of my conception of poetry.
Sure.
And, I think what I didn't realize at the time was that this is exactly why many poets translate. They're looking for something that they can't find in their own language or cultural milieu. And, like, even if it ends up that whatever you find, the sensibility, the images, the sounds, whatever, right? Even if it's there in your culture or language, and I think it almost always is, you can find a lot of the stuff that impressed me in French symbolism in, I don't know, 17th century English poetry or 14th century Italian poetry. The process of searching and finding and negotiating the language barrier and articulating the work in a new idiom, it almost necessarily stimulates you into producing something that feels new and invigorating. And so, my sense of poetic vocation and translatorly vocation kind of go together.
Right.
I translate principally from the Italian, which is a language I learned in college and then sort of relearned. And I went to Italy and spent time there. And
Nice.
My interests there were both literary and personal because I've got my family origins are there.
Very cool.
But I translate from it occasionally. I've got some translations that are coming out in an anthology that will be out soon. And I'd like to do more of it as well as from the French. At the moment, though, it's taken something of a backseat to my own poems. I tend to translate when I'm feeling like in a rut creatively. And when I'm feeling creative, translation tends to sort of go to the side.
Yeah, that was one of the things I was going to ask you, that, you have the writing creatively part in your poetry practice. Then you also have the heavy analysis you do through criticism and theoretical things.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have this third thing, this translation, which is this whole, again, this whole other very complex order of thinking here. And so you do find yourself kind of bouncing between them according to what zone you're in.
Yeah. Yes, definitely. I think that, like poetry, translation is something that demands creativity and flexibility, but then also an analytical kind of approach or interpretive, approach. So I think, it's stimulating both of those things simultaneously.
Definitely. Yeah. Speaking of poems and poetry and stuff, what about reading a poem for our audience?
Sure. I'll read something that was published recently in the magazine Posit. This piece is called Circles. They sent me to school in the great forest, planted by the timber company, where each morning the chaplain would pray to the trees. There was a river somewhere, but I was afraid to go down to it on account of the color of the water, menacingly clear, as though all the silt and leaves and branches and rocks had no real contact with anything. Things sat or floated on. That was it. Nothing mixed. I usually couldn't find the river anyway, and was always getting lost in the woods, until the wardens came galloping on their Arabians to bring me back for my punishment of competitive knitting. I never won, or even made a hat or scarf I would not be too embarrassed to wear. And so when winter came, I was not only chastened, but chilled. That's when you found me, staring at the stopped clock, and showed me the way out. A ritual where we locked the door, turned up the halogen lamps, and stared at each other until we decided which swimsuits most flattered our blanched bodies. High-cut one-pieces or string bikinis. The parrot helped too, from his roost in the common room, even if he only said things he had been trained to say. What color? Be good. Wanna go. Wanna go.
Great. Again, that was Circles from the journal Posit, a journal of literature and art. And we'll have a link for that in the show notes and on the website, all that good stuff. You had this quote on Twitter. I dug in your Twitter maybe the past month or so, see what you were about to prep for this. And you had this quote on there. Well, you posted this. You said, "Poems are fictional and non-fictional at the same time, just like the self." And I was like, shit, I want to put that on the back of my T-shirt or something like that, man. It's great. Tell me, maybe you want to tell us a little bit about that poem. I don't want to make this English class or anything like that, even because we're professors, we can get in that mode. But like, what about that poem? What are you trying to? That's the thing. It's like, what am I supposed to come away with here? How did you arrive at this idea to this execution?
Yeah, well, I think that it's the remark was just something I had dashed down while working on some other things, and I thought, let's see what other people think of this. And I guess people, seemed to think something of it.
Yeah.
It got more love than my tweets usually do.
Right.
But I think I've been thinking a lot about the fact that poets write from their lives and also don't write from their lives, and that's happening often in the same poem, and frequently, in within a line of a poem. And so there's the fact that we mix things that are parts of our lives with things that are not, and that was the case in this poem, Circles. That is to say, there are things that are non-fictional about that poem.
Sure.
That is to say, things that occurred or exist in this world. And then there are things in that poem that are fictional, that did not occur or that exist in a fictional world.
Right.
And so there's this kind of paradoxical tension. But I think there's another dimension to it, which is not just descriptive, but in being fictional and non-fictional at the same time, oftentimes what poems are doing are pointing out something that is dissatisfying, or frustrating, or blocking about this world. So the fictional element, some people like to think of it as a utopian element, right? Or a critical element. And I think that's sort of what I was getting at here, is that there are things about this world that are problems.
Right.
And poems often express a wish for those problems to be solved, even though I think we know, right, there are some problems that we don't appear to be able to solve. Principally, death.
Sure.
And mortality is a great motivator of poetry, and immortality is a great aspiration of poetry.
Yes. I like that.
But also the problem of, just different consciousnesses. I mean, there's a barrier between us, between people. I'll never be inside your head, and you'll never be inside mine. And poetry is a kind of a way to sort of wish that away.
Sure.
I can't take credit for that, for the ideas I've just professed. They came to me from Alan Grossman, who was a great, now deceased, great poet and critic, not well known enough.
Cool.
But that's how I think I would connect that tweet to the poem. Both it's like a description of features of the poem, and also like a description of the aspirations of the poem.
Yeah, I think a lot of poetry we read and study and like and admire are built this way, and that even through school and stuff, we're almost kind of that idea that poems are fictional and non-fictional at the same time. But then, you and I have both, been at readings somewhere, right? And Q&A time comes around, and somebody read a short story, somebody read a poem. It's like, oh, was that autobiographical? And it's like, well, everything I write is part of me. Like, it's such a weird, simple non-question, but such a fucking complex idea at the same time that it's like I could just want to just kind of dismiss it and move on, or I could talk about it for 2 or 3 hours, because everything I write is part of me, right? Even if something as simple as like, writing a book review or something like that, like you still have to inject, you into that. And so you do have this fictional and non-fictional friction in a lot of poetry and a lot of writing. Yeah.
Yeah. I sometimes have gotten that question
Yes.
about autobiography, and I share your impatience with it.
God,
And
dude.
what I usually respond with is, can you tell me why that matters to you? Or what would you think if I said yes or no?
Right.
And usually it starts a conversation about, values and authenticity. That's more interesting than the question of, did this actually happen?
Sure. Yeah.
So, yeah. I mean, I try not to be impatient with I
No,
mean,
I
I'm happy to
understand.
be asked questions,
Yeah.
period.
Yeah.
But
Same.
it is,
Same.
it can be frustrating. I would say that, it didn't occur to me until just now, but, it's not just poets who are in this paradoxical situation. I'm not a scholar of fiction, but I'm a reader of fiction, and the whole genre of auto fiction seems to me
What
to
is
be,
that?
yeah, right. Well, it seems to me to
Yeah.
be another way of saying something is fictional and non-fictional at the same time. Uh,
Right. Right.
and I think that the statement goes on to say, just like the self, right? I think that we create ourselves. Daniel Dennett says that we're all virtuoso novelists writing, the story of our lives in acting as the people we are. So there's a kind of artificial aspect to the self, but then there's like the non-artificial aspect of consciousness, right? I think that
Yeah.
consciousness is real,
Sure.
and it's not an artifact in the sense that it's being made. It's there. I think consciousness is a kind of a given.
Right.
So that there's both of those things happening at the same time, in our sense of ourselves. I think it's it's rare to find somebody who feels that the self is totally made up, but also rare to find someone who believes it's just totally a given that you have no control over at all.
Right. Yeah, I think most people, most reasonable people are, yeah, somewhere in that middle part there for sure. Speaking of, you brought up Shel Silverstein earlier, and I saw that you had a handful of vintage Playboy magazines, and one of them had Shel Silverstein in the table of contents.
Mm-hmm.
And I had just picked up a 1964, I think it's October, and I grabbed it because there was a Bradbury story in there, and
Yeah.
An interview, a boxing interview, Muhammad Ali interview in there. Speaking of Louisville, Kentucky.
Yes, native son Muhammad Ali.
Yeah, and what's interesting there in that article I have, it's an interview as Cassius Clay in '64, and I think that's the year he was publicly saying, "Call me Muhammad Ali."
Okay.
And so I think it might be one of the last high profile ones.
Mm-hmm.
Any other cool gems you find like that in your stack of Playboy mags?
Yeah,
Not to sell you out
I
there, but you put it on Twitter, so I figured I'd bring it up.
yeah, I happened upon a few in a used book sale here in
Right.
Louisville,
That's where I found mine.
and
Used bookstore.
I was buying other things, but I thought if these are still around by the end, I'm going to pick them up because they were very inexpensive and they looked to be in good shape. And I was curious about them. I had never owned. I don't recall ever owning or purchasing a pornographic magazine.
Uh-huh.
So at the end of the sale, I bought them, and the sale was at a church here in Louisville. And so
That's
as
tremendous.
I'm checking out, I bought a lot of books, and there's the Playboys. These old church ladies
Bunch of
who are
French
checking me out,
philosophy and then a stack of Playboys.
they're leafing through the Playboys, and one of them looks at the cover and says, "Oh, I remember this one." And it was just a really funny moment because for them, they would have been part of a generation where that magazine would just be like part of the furniture,
Sure.
So I got a few more, at an online auction. I'm just very I'm just curious about them, principally as artifacts of middle brow intellectual
Right.
culture. I think
Right.
that Hefner had a sense of what intellectual life looked like to, or should look like to, the mass consumer of media.
For sure.
And, there's the knock on this, right, is that he basically just got inferior work from big names, right?
Right.
And I haven't read through
All of them. Yeah.
all of them, so I don't know. I think that's probably maybe a little unjust. But I read a Vonnegut story in one of them, and Ray Bradbury, but the reporting is frequently, I think, good. There's lots of articles on civil rights and contraception, Vietnam. Vietnam is obviously a big issue in the pages of all media in the 60s. And then the interviews are excellent. So the Muhammad Ali interview is a good example. And I read the Stanley Kubrick interview. That was one of the pieces I got at the book sale. One of the issues had that sticker on the cover advertising, and it's terrific. And so, I'm just very curious about that, in part because, like, there's something validating as an intellectual about a project that brings intellectual life to lots of people, right? So, nowadays we talk about public humanities, but there's like an element of Playboy that was doing that. Of course, right? Of course, it's deeply misogynistic. Of course, it's on the back. All that's true. All that's true.
100%.
But it's kind of it's an interesting sort of tension paradox.
Yeah, it does have a really, the way you framed it when you said that, it kind of gives us this, or I'm paraphrasing, that it gives you this kind of snapshot of this portrait of what the perception of what, this, like you said, middle brow, like / wanting to be highbrow culture and
upper middle brow.
There we go. Right. Just trying to eke on over. And like when I see a stack of the vintage Playboys at a used bookstore, I flip through and I just look at the table of contents, and you can see, like, if you look at several from the 60s, you really do get an impression of what they were trying to project there with the writers they're getting, the movie stars they're interviewing, and stuff like that, and whatnot. Yeah. It's really interesting.
Something that you've said makes me think that what's interesting to me is the attempt to integrate the intellectual into a lifestyle, right?
It's a lifestyle magazine, exactly.
To fit intellectual debate into a lifestyle. And, there's a history of doing that, and Playboys would be part of that history.
Yeah. Speaking of history and stuff like this, you said you're into old cars, at least your Twitter bio says. In what capacity about old cars? Like wrenching on them? Or I know you put cool pictures of some at like maybe car shows or cars and coffee type stuff. Tell me about your old car fascination.
So I was a car fanatic from the beginning as a child. I think car was one of my first words, and I had a robust collection of Matchbox cars as a child. One of the stories my parents like to tell is we took a trip. I must have been two or three, to Greece and Yugoslavia, and this would have been 1980. And we were in a resort, I guess, on the Dalmatian coast. And I go to the pool, and there's a couple of European kids running around, and here I am, the American, and I've got my carrying case full of Matchbox cars. And I open it up, and like apparently it was a huge scene. All the kids come running, and even though we didn't speak the same language, my parents always say that, like we made the same noises with the cars, and that was like,
oh my God, that's so fucking cool, dude.
So I grew up car crazy. My parents didn't really like American cars. It was the malaise era, and they also, they might have had a bit of aspirational snobbery as part of that. But I grew up surrounded by Volvos, BMW, Porsche, even Range Rover. I think my father was one of the first people to buy the Range Rover when it was reintroduced to the United States. He was a surgeon. He needed a car to be able to get in and out of New York City in inclement weather. And of course, there were lots of other cars he could have bought to do that. But he was attracted to the kind of the vintage sportsman aspect of the Rover.
They're so cool, yeah.
Our nanny, Mary, who lived with us during the week, she bought a great looking Fox body Mustang in 1986. And that was a car I loved dearly, and learned in part to drive in that car.
Nice.
Unfortunately, it did not have the big 5-liter engine.
I was about to say, was it a little 5.0 Fox body?
No, but it's sharp looking car.
Oh, hell yeah.
I remember my dad used to let me skip school, and he took me to the New York Auto Show, 87, 88, 89. And it was an exciting time because, the 90s were approaching, and like a lot of the 90s cars were visible in concept form in the late 80s. Right. And, in the 90s, I think it's now generally recognized, truly great era for automobiles.
So many cool 90s cars, yeah.
Yes. And, now they're appreciating quite rapidly, since we're all sort of nostalgic for our childhoods. But my interest waned a little bit in college and graduate school until I inherited my father-in-law's 1974 Volkswagen Carmen Ghia.
Oh, little Ghia, that kind of 1600 dual port, yeah.
Yeah, that reignited things. And so in the past few years, I've begun to learn to wrench on cars, the VW, and also my BMW, which is 17 years old. So it's almost an antique now.
Oh, yeah.
But I take it to the racetrack on occasion, so things tend to wear out and break. So
I do track days, man. On the
I do. As much as I can. It's expensive and time consuming, but man, it is a rush. It is a rush.
No, I'm a big car guy and stuff. And first car was a '71 Volkswagen Squareback.
Oh wow! Okay.
So I'm
quite rare now. Quite rare now,
dude. It's one of those I kick myself for, but I had to sell it to go to school and shit, so you can go to grad school and whatnot. But
I think every car person needs an old Volkswagen in their life at some point, in part because they're so easy to work on, and you have to work on them. So it prepares you.
They really are again, dude, that 1600 that's in your Ghia, dude, I know where every bolt on that fucking engine goes now. Like, because I had that Squareback, then after that there was a 68, then there was a 77 Baja, and then very simple though. Like, the only thing simpler is a motorcycle engine,
Right.
That's the only thing simpler, really.
I think there's a learning curve with old cars, and I think VW is a good place to start.
Oh yeah.
And then British, and then maybe you go to the continent. I think you ascend the degree of difficulty. You get closer to Italy and France, where I think the engineering is incredible, but the having to do the maintenance is you really have to be an expert mechanic.
No, yeah. About a year or two ago, I started looking at the late '90s Porsche Boxsters because I can afford one now, and so I'm like, hell yeah. But you're right, they're appreciating. Just the last 2 years, I'm like, dang, they keep going up a couple grand every year now. I can't grab one because I want one for cruise around on the weekends and then do track days was kind of my plan, or autocross or something like that.
Right.
Very cool.
That's a good choice. I think that they are appreciating. Everything is, I don't know if this will be that interesting to people.
Sure. Well, they'll listen anyway.
There's a mania now for air-cooled Porsches, and those 911s have become so stratospherically priced that they've lifted prices of other cars, and the Boxer would be an example of that. That's a good choice. I've thought about that myself. I've never owned a convertible, so that my next purchase, I'm sure, will be a drop top. I'm working on a critical book. I have to finish that book, and then I think I'm
reward yourself. There you go.
Hunting for a vintage, simple convertible.
No, yeah, something we can get the sun on you. Yeah, had an '86 and then an '87 Nissan 300ZX.
I love that.
T-tops, both of them. That last one
Yeah.
was really clean when I got rid of it, man. But yeah, silver with the T-tops, nice stereo and everything. Very, very, very stock. Very, very stock. And I got a lot of compliments on that one. Sounded cool. Not fast. It was
Right.
kind of a pig on the road or whatever, but
Yeah.
sounded cool. Looked fast.
Yeah, that car doesn't get enough love, I
The
think.
Z31, yeah.
It's kind of like, it goes missing in between the 280 and 260 and 240 on the one hand, and then the subsequent 300ZX, which is an incredible
Yeah,
car.
keep up with the Supra with that twin turbo. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So you mentioned your book. Tell me about your next projects and the manuscripts you're working on. I know some of your poetry stuff has been finalists and won contests, things like this. Tell me about your next projects, both on the creative end and your criticism.
Sure. So I'm still trying to get my first full length poetry manuscript
Cool.
published. Book's called Past Lives, and once every 9 months, it's a finalist for something.
Yeah.
And that keeps me in the game.
Right,
But
right.
it also can be a little bit frustrating. But I have started a new poetry manuscript. The working title is Central Time. It's about being in the middle of things. In part, it's about Chicago, where I was for a decade while I was getting my PhD. But it's also about centers and middles.
Right.
My critical book it's a book on philosophy and literature. It's about skepticism and impersonality in modernist poetry, and that book deals with Emily Dickinson, T.S. Eliot, Paul Valéry, Elizabeth Bishop, James Merrill, all great poets, all poets that mean a lot to me, very different poets. And the argument of that book is that the impersonality that we find in modern poetry should be seen as a response to skeptical doubts about the publicity of our experiences. So I was kind of mentioning this earlier in the podcast.
Yeah.
So that book will be part of a series on philosophy and poetry that Bloomsbury is doing. It's a very interesting series for those of us who are into that stuff.
Yeah. Very cool, man. Well, good. Well, we wish you luck on all those projects, man. Very cool. And so, very well established that you are a writer, and this is the Writers and Fighters podcast. I always ask the writers, though, do you have any experience or any interest in stuff in the fight world?
I do. I mean, as a kid, I loved boxing, and the 80s were an exciting time for boxing. I think of the rise of Mike Tyson,
Of course.
when he beat Spinks
Yeah.
in like 90 seconds or however few seconds it was, when he lost to Buster Douglas. I mean, I don't remember the year exactly when he lost. It might have been I'm not sure, but they were major events, and they were captivating. My father was captivated by them. I was captivated by them. I remember not watching, but hearing a lot, both before and after the Sugar Ray Leonard, Marvin Hagler fight. And I loved to watch Olympic boxing too.
Yeah.
I didn't really keep up with it. I will say my PhD advisor, Bob von Hallberg, is a legend in Chicago because he was a literature professor who was deeply interested in boxing. And he's a guy you should have on the podcast.
Put me in contact. Yeah.
Yeah, he teaches now at Claremont McKenna. But I deeply regret not going to, I think the intensity of his interest sort of predated my arrival in Chicago, but there were rumors that he would take graduate students to the fights or even to the gym to like work out on a bag. And honestly, I would have benefited from, working a body bag at some points in my dissertation. But a few years ago, I thought about doing boxing lessons here in Louisville. There's a gym very close to where I live, but there was some skepticism in the household about whether I was maybe too old
You're old and your brain's worth too much, dude. So
I might need brain cells too much. So we'll see. It's a possibility. Yeah.
No, yeah, it's one of those things you can always train and just never spar, man. Plenty of people do that, and I'm again, as somebody who went through the grad school grind and the writing frustrations and the sending stuff out and getting all that. Yeah, who couldn't hit a heavy bag in the garage every once in a while, right? Well, cool, man. Hey, well, good luck on all your stuff. How do we keep up with you and direct people to what you're up to? Social media,
Sure.
website, what you got, bud?
Yeah, so I am on Twitter and I am active on it, and you can find me at @VJoshuaAdams on Twitter. And there is also a website, vjoshuaadams.com, which has got some of my creative and critical pieces on there. I'd be very happy to hear from anybody who listens to this about anything I've said or the poems or whatever.
Great, man. Great. We will put your social media link, the Twitter link, in the description for this, in the show notes, and we'll put the website up there as well. Joshua, I really appreciate you making some time and talking writing stuff and talking car stuff and fight stuff. Very good conversation, man. I really appreciate you.
It was a joy. Thank you so much.
All right. Take care. All right, y'all. Thanks for listening to that interview with Joshua Adams, poet, critic, translator, and car guy, calling in from Louisville, Kentucky, home of Muhammad Ali. I want to thank Joshua again. If you want to keep up with him, go over to Twitter at @VJoshuaAdams. @VJoshuaAdams on Twitter. He also has a website, vjoshuaadams.com. Has links to his essays, links to some poems. If you want to find out more about Joshua, go over there. I want to thank him once again. And I want to thank y'all for listening to the podcast and being patient as this content comes out. I know I was late this week, but the good news is I have 4 or 5 interviews already in the can. They'll be coming out in the next several weeks. So you can keep up with the podcast by subscribing on your favorite podcast app. You can also get updates on social media because we're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, even YouTube. If you want to look at the episodes we've had in the past already, go over to writersandfighters.com. Appreciate you guys listening. You guys be good, be safe, and take care of each other. Talk next week.